Domingo in the Dominican Republic. I hope you are well. I'm Elisabeth Robert. I'm coordinating the course on gender responsive budgeting. And we are in the 4th week of our course, and today is our first web conference. We would like to very much thank Shrijna Dixon for accepting our invitation. We know that she's very busy and she's sick, I think, today. So it's an honor to have her with us today. I will present her shortly. Shrijna is a social researcher with specialization in applied qualitative research, social communications, consumer behavior, and psychology, and intercultural relations. Shrijna has worked with diverse constituents, including the government, multilateral and bilateral agencies, and grassroots organizations. She has about 8 years of experience in the social and development sector, focused on gender sensitization, women empowerment, education, livelihood generation, and inclusive economic development, among others. Currently, she's working for UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific on gender, women, peace and security. And she has also worked on designing, strategizing and assessing development projects for national and subnational government during her time with Ernst & Young. Shrijna has a master in social psychology from the London School of Economics and Political Science. One of her interests is to explore the behavioral variables influencing policy implementation, decision-making, and desired programmatic results, especially in the socio-economic context. Shrijna also worked in the multi-country office in India, and she worked a lot on gender responsive budgeting, and they developed in that time 3 papers that we thought we would be very interesting to she present the papers to us, so that's why she's here with us today. And as usual, we also have our team connected. So you can see Alexandra here, your dear tutor, monitor. I see that you have a lot of discussions in the forum. That's very good. Thank you for this. And we have Sabrina Beniz, who is supporting us with, she will take care of the question and answer session. So before I give the floor to Shrijna, I want to show you how you can use this fantastic tool, GoToWebinar. So during the presentation of Shrijna, you will be able to send comments, or it can be a question, it can be a comment during all our presentation. To do that, you can see there is a box called chat or questions. No, questions, sorry, questions. So you click on it and you write your question. Sabrina will take all those questions, and at the end we will show the question and Shrijna will have a time to respond. Also, we want to tell you that this webinar is recorded. We have a YouTube channel in the training center, so we will upload it in YouTube, and then people who could not attend will be able to watch the video. In fact, we ask them to watch it and to send us a summary reflection of 2 paragraphs so that we are sure you saw all the video. In case you have connectivity problems, please switch off the cameras. In fact, we will switch off the cameras now while Shrijna is presenting. So do not hesitate to send us a message via the chat or the question if you have any problem, and we hope it would be very interesting for you, and we are looking forward for your questions. So the floor is yours, Shrijna. Okay, so now I switch off the cameras so that we are sure we can hear you well.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. Hello, everyone. I hope all of you can hear me loud and clear. I'm really pleased to be facilitating this session for you. As I went, over the contents that this, I believe, absolutely uh, amazing course on GRB has covered so far, and the array of topics that all of you have now completed, from understanding GRB around the world, to building strategic alliances, to being introduced to approaches to GRB and some of the critical concepts such as practical and strategic gender needs, substantive equality, and intersectionalities. So I thought like this particular session on applying GRB actually puts together in a way all puts together the learnings from all of the past sessions that you guys have covered so far. In terms of the overview of what we are going to cover over the next 20 minutes, 30 minutes, what you see in front of your screens and on the slide, we're going to just refresh our understanding and very briefly on GRB planning and budgeting cycle. So the 4 phases of gender responsive budgeting, the planning and budgeting cycle. Then we're going to focus on how we apply GRB using and rather contextualizing Debbie Badlender's 5-step framework. Now, Debbie Badlender's 5-step framework is one of the most widely used GRB tools, and I believe this has been covered in your past presentations, sessions on GRB tools. But I bring this back today so that we can contextualize some of the examples that I will be sharing on GRB application. And so I intend to share about 2 to 3 examples of GRB focused and contextualized within India, and targeting the marginalized women and girls in the country. Next slide, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, could you please move the slide?
Hello. Yes, we have our first poll first. So I will send some questions to you for the audience, and I will ask you to respond to them. Can you see them now? Okay, so the question is over 100 countries globally have adopted gender responsive budgeting. Do you agree with this, or do you disagree? I think you have something on this on the module 1. So we have now people responding. 57% of people voted, so we are waiting for some more. 70. So you have just to go to the screen and click on a response. What do you think? Over 10,000 countries globally adopted GRB. Do you think it's right or wrong? Okay, so we're missing some of you. 86. I think we are missing 1 or 2 people. So you just have to click on the screen and respond. One more left. Okay, maybe it's not clear how to do it. So for this one, I will maybe finish here. And okay, 100%. Excellent. So I think I have to close now to the, okay. I have a problem because I don't see the results. Sabrina, if you see them, please take the mic and comment on them. Okay,
Yeah,
no,
so we
here
have,
I have. Yeah, go on.
57% agree that there are over 100 countries globally that they have adopted, and 43% disagree.
Okay, so Shrijna, the floor is yours. What do you think of this answer? People are divided.
Yeah, but I believe the majority have actually picked the correct answer. So yes, there is indeed 100 countries globally that have adopted one or the other mechanism or initiative on gender responsive budgeting, and about a quarter of them, 25% of them, are actually in the Asia Pacific region. So the answer is 100 countries globally.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so let's follow with your presentation.
Yes, so can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. Yes, so I know that all of you have gone over the four critical stages of the GRB planning and budgeting cycle. Well, this is essentially what you see on your screen. So the four stages, starting from formulation to legislation, implementation, and then audit stage. These are pretty much universal stages for planning and budgeting that that is being undertaken by all nations globally. Uh, and what this slide intends to do is to introduce specific examples wherein we can plug in GRB along the planning and budgeting cycle. And I am referring to this cycle here so that when we discuss examples of applying GRB in the following slides, we are able to understand which stage of the planning cycle that specific example applied GRB. So at the formulation stage, which is pretty much about planning your budgets, when the ministries of finance develop budget called circulars, and then they instruct line ministries, sectoral ministries to develop their demand for grants and to submit it to the ministries of finance. So formulation stage is a stage of negotiation, between sectoral ministries and the ministries of finance, and you have ways of plugging in GRB at the formulation stage. But the three examples that I have for this presentation are actually at the implementation stage, wherein we assessed specific policies and schemes of the government in implementation, and them using the gender lens. So this is these four stages. I think we should really keep this blueprint in our minds whenever we are working on gender responsive budgeting. So this was just to give us a very brief snapshot of where all and how you can possibly plug in GRB along the government's four critical stages of planning and budgeting. Next slide, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. As I shared with all of you earlier, I know that the tools on GRB have been covered, and Debbie Budlender's five-step framework is one of the most widely applied tools on GRB, globally. Uh, this five-step framework is also an overarching framework to assess interventions from the stage of planning to auditing. So if we go back to the planning and budgeting cycle, you could apply the five-step framework along, the entire planning and budgeting cycle. And the specific cases that I will discuss today started off with using Debbie Budlender's framework as the guiding, framework, as the foundational framework for applying GRB via, understanding the needs and situation of the constituents of women and girls in our context, assessing, whether the policies were aligned to their specific needs and concerns, whether there were adequate budgets for these policies, and for closing, gender gaps in select sectors that we picked, how the government policies monitored, these policies over time to ensure that the results were being met as per the original planned vision, mission, and outcomes of these policies. And the last one is to really assess results, at the impact level, at outcome level. So I refer to this framework as the foundational framework that we used to guide, the very mechanism and methodology and approach for applying GRB in the contexts that I will be sharing with you. Next slide, Elizabeth.
Okay, we have another question prepared by Shrijna, so I will just send it now. Okay, so it says GRB has its own set of tools which are different from other tools of analysis that we use for research and evaluation. Do you agree with this, or do you disagree? So I think you got it now. We have 43% people who voted. It's increasing. So do you, for now, people, I cannot say, I have to maintain the suspense. So I think we are missing 2 or 3 people. GRB has its own set of tools which are different from other tools of analysis that we use for research and evaluation. Do you agree with this, or do you disagree? Okay, I think we are missing 1 person. 1 or 2. Please vote before. Excellent. Thank you very much. So every one who is connected agree with this sentence, Shrijna. Are you okay with this response?
Interesting.
What do you think?
I think this question is also open to interpretation. So perhaps, when we open the floor for Q&A and for discussion, we can discuss this question and elaborate, on this. There is no one size that fits all. There is no a GRB tool that can fit in all contexts, yeah, and across all sectors. And GRB does not really have its own set of tools. So for example, even if you sorry, even if you look at the 5-step framework, and if you break down the 5 steps, the first step is situation analysis. What the 5-step really adds on to the situation analysis, what Debbie Budlender really adds to the situation analysis, is a gender lens. Not that conducting a situation analysis or conducting a needs assessment is a new or a GRB specific tool per se. So the answer to that, and I would say that this is perhaps open to interpretation, but GRB does not necessarily have a set of its own tools. GRB is about plugging in gender, into tools, into existing tools. So for example, even an expenditure analysis, if you conduct an expenditure analysis through a gender lens, that then becomes a GRB tool. Elizabeth, over to you.
Okay, I understand your point of view, but I think yes, sometimes the question, as you say, you can interpret in different ways.
Yes,
but as you
yes.
say,
But
let's
this is an interesting
discuss
question.
on yes, let's leave
Yes,
that
yes.
for the question and answers. I remind you that you can write your questions in the question box at any moment. Okay, so let's go now with the examples.
Great. Next slide, Elizabeth. Thank you. So the first example that I will discuss is wherein UN Women India applied GRB through the lens of girls from minorities, girls from scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and I will actually discuss a bit about these minority classes with you briefly in a while. So what UN Women intended to do was to select schemes and use gender responsive budgeting to understand how a scheme was responding to the needs and to the priorities of girls from minorities. And the specific sector that we picked was the education sector. Now, just to set this case study in a context, in India, the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, they are at the bottom of the caste hierarchy. The scheduled castes comprise 17% and the scheduled tribes comprise 9% of the total population of the country. And there are a number of constitutional guarantees and provisions for the right to education to all children, irrespective of caste, creed, religion, so on and so forth. So while you have constitutional provisions for universal education, and you have sound policies both at the national level, the literacy rates of the scheduled castes and minority girls in particular have not really improved over the years. Of course, since independence, the numbers have shown improvement. If you literacy rates, let's say for the total the literacy rates for girls from these minority communities, these girls lag far behind. To give you an example, the literacy rates for female scheduled castes, so for female minorities, is 57% compared to 66% for females of the total population in the country. So there are gaps in literacy rates among these minority girls. So this is just to set the context. And also another relevant thing that I want to point out is that the gross enrollment ratio, which is the number of children who are going to school divided by the total number of children in that in that age range and the total population in that age range. So that's really the gross enrollment ratio. So the gross enrollment ratio has actually shown a marked improvement, at the primary level and at the upper primary level for the general category, as well as for girls and children from minorities. But when it comes to enrollment ratio, at the senior secondary level and at higher levels, where it is most critical in a way, because that's really the transition phase where the transition phase between education and livelihood attainment, the numbers for girls from minorities are really low. To give you an example, the number for minority girls for higher education for females is just about 18%, 18%. So only 18% of minority girls are able to complete their higher education. Now, this was to give you, the context and the objective behind undertaking this analysis. So, what did we do? We picked one of the Government of India's flagship schemes for the minority girls, which is called the Kasturba Gandhi Balika scheme. Now, I'm going to refer this as KGBV. Now, the Government of India launched this before, as you can read it on your slide, and these schools actually reserve 75% of seats only for girls to minorities, and about 25% of seats are reserved for girls from families that are below the poverty line. So the objective of this study is of these schools and to analyze their according to minority girls in the education policy. And we picked the state of Bihar, least developed states in the country. One of the reasons for picking is have literacy for minorities. So we picked the state of Bihar, and we conducted this analysis in 2 districts, in 2 provinces of Bihar, namely Aurangabad and Munger. Now, what was the approach that we followed? The first approach was to conduct a secondary analysis of all the policy and budget documents that were available. So available in the public domain, as well as available through reaching out to relevant authorities, such as the ministries of education, of human resources, development, and so on and so forth. And this was then triangulated. So secondary literature was triangulated by findings from primary data that we collected from 12 of these schools across these 2 provinces. And the primary data essentially entailed testimonies of these minority girls, their parents, as well as school authorities and administrators. Next slide, Elizabeth. Thank you. So I am now going to discuss, the key findings of this study. that we have actually categorized into 4 key findings. So the first finding was on gaps in policy design. So the study revealed that there was limited reach against an overwhelming demand. So while there are these schools in every state of the country, but there are 17% SCs, and I said about 9% scheduled tribes in the country. So the demand for these schools is much higher than the number of schools. And by way of limited schools, the policy in itself excludes the girls who this scheme is actually meant to be benefiting. So a large number of girls who are out of school girls do not have access to this policy, to these schools, simply because there are not enough number of them. So that's really one of the major challenges in closing, the gap in secondary education among these minority girls. Also, interestingly, the primary data findings revealed that about 75% of the parents who were interviewed, they worked as manual agricultural laborers or brick kiln workers, and about 88% of them had wages of less than $14 per month. And consequently, 78% of these parents cited dependence on their daughter's labor. So whether formal labor, informal labor, or unpaid or underpaid labor as a deterrent in allowing them to pursue higher education. So if these are the issues that are really creating a barrier for these girls to attending the school, the policy has to somehow align its goal and its reach and its accessibility, keeping these socio-cultural concerns and economic concerns in mind, right? So one of the other findings was on gaps in budgeting. So the cost and the budgets for this scheme are actually shared proportionately between the national and the subnational government. And on paper and on policy, the scheme uh, the scheme actually promotes decentralized and participatory process. But the primary data revealed that local planners were provided only limited flexibility to innovate as per existing realities, which means that there were no decentralized, participatory, and inclusive planning that was being followed, although this was mandated and prescribed in the policy. So these were barriers, at the ground level. Uh, the other group of findings was on gaps in implementation. And some of the data that I would share with you are on the infrastructure issues. With this particular scheme. So of the 12 KGBVs that were socially audited, I would really call it, social audit of these schools. A quarter of these schools were being run in temporary buildings. So they were not even permanent structures, buildings to run these schools. There were also no standard norms being followed to run these schools. So, for example, the number of rooms per school ranged anywhere between 2 rooms to a maximum of 14 rooms. So, whereas in one block, you had a school that was running out of merely 2 rooms. You also had another school in the same district that had 14 rooms to itself. Also, the ratio of girls to bathrooms and to toilets was really skewed. It was 25 girls to one bathroom, and it was 16 girls to one toilet, which actually reflects on the lacking sanitation facilities for these girls. These schools are actually meant to house girls from 6 to 8 standards. So these are all girls who have attained puberty. So you can really imagine how this skewed ratio would actually impact the hygiene of the hygiene needs of these girls. So just to give you a few examples, and I will share the detailed study with you, hard copy, so that you can go over it. Just very briefly, what you see on the slide is a table where we tried innovating with our methodology. So we picked the school and we compared the unit cost. How do we use GRB social audits? So we used the unit cost for specific budget heads, which you can see on your screen. For KGB, we actually compared them with another school, which are also fully residential co-educational schools, but which ask for a bare minimum fees, from boys and girls. And the other schools and these that you see on your screen, they also cater to rural boys and girls, but quote unquote rural elite boys and girls. So boys and girls who can actually afford a fees to get into these schools. And so these schools, the NVs, also reserve seats for minority girls and minority boys, and also reserve 33% seats for girls. However, you can see the marked discrepancy. I'm sorry, because the figures are in Indian rupees, but just for you to compare, you can see for yourself that the construction costs for a KGBV school that we studied were about 39,000 compared to 500,000 for this another school. So this slide actually reflects and demonstrates to us that if there are discrepant budgets, at the basic level to serve the basic education needs of girls and of children, then the impact is bound to be gender insensitive. So that's just one example. I can take up, questions on this later. Elizabeth, if we have, I believe we have some time, so I would just like to touch upon the second case study. So we can go on to the next slide.
Oh, we have the last poll before. So
Sure.
The last question. Can you see it now? Okay. GRB can be integrated into existing approach and methodology of an assessment. It's a little bit related with the previous discussion, I think. So do you agree with this or not? We have 43% of people who voted. Keep responding, please, to on the screen. 57. Okay, 86. I think we miss maybe one or two people. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So 86% of respondents agree with this sentence, which is that GRB can be integrated into existing approach and methodology of an assessment. The floor is yours, Shrijna.
Great, great. As Elizabeth pointed out, this is actually a sub-question to our last poll question, and I'm really enjoying these polls, Elizabeth. It's a great idea. Yes, in fact, that's really what we have to continue doing. We have to continue innovating with GRB. So we have to continue integrating it into any existing approaches and methods. So yes, I'm happy that a lot of we've gotten a lot of right answers to this one. Okay, so we can
with
slide
the other case
now.
Yeah, women in agriculture. Can you see it?
No, I can't, Elizabeth.
Oh, it's on the screen.
I actually still see the poll on my screen. Yeah, I can see it now. Thank you.
I'm
I can
sorry.
see it now. Yes.
Okay.
No, it's okay.
Sorry, I didn't
Great.
close it. It's my fault. Okay.
Oh, that's fine.
Okay.
So I know we we may be running out of time. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes, couple of more minutes, taking through the second case study on women in agriculture, also within the Indian context. Now, UN Women in 2015. Now, this is a fairly recent study that we published, and it's up on our website. So I can share the link with Ellen later. She can forward it to all of you. Again, to set the context. The budget for this year of the Indian government, as well as the economic survey that the Indian government commissions every year, had a really interesting critical finding on women farmers. The economic survey pointed out that there is an increasing trend of feminization of agriculture in the country. Now, India is a country where 58% of its population lives, on agriculture as the main source of livelihood. 65% of female workers depend on agriculture, whether they own land or whether they don't own land. And we have no data on how many women in India own land. We only have data on the operational holdings. So about 13%, only 13% of women have operational holdings, which simply means that they operate on land. We do not know whether they own that piece of land or not. 65% of females, as I shared earlier, depend on agriculture, compared to only 50% of male workers in the country. And this figure actually substantiates and validates what I mentioned about the increasing trend of feminization of agriculture. Now, there are a number of plethora of reasons for feminization of agriculture. We'll need another, session to talk about that, to discuss that. But within the scope, of this presentation, UN Women in 2015. So we conducted an assessment to understand how GRB is operationalized, in the agriculture sector, and we wanted to identify challenges, gaps, and any positive experiences in the implementation of select beneficiary-oriented schemes. So we picked beneficiary-oriented schemes that catered to a large proportion of women farmers. And the study findings were actually then also used for designing a practical tool and a step-by-step GRB training manual for capacity building of department officials from agriculture. And the India office has already conducted a number of trainings at the national level as well as at the sub-national level in one of the states of the country. So this training and the study has really had an interesting uptake, from diverse stakeholders, including the government, wherein the national and subnational governments actually invited UN Women to conduct trainings on GRB for their agriculture officers. Now, coming back to the study, what is the approach that we used? So we picked 2 schemes in agriculture. This was in consultation with the Ministry of Agriculture in the country. So one of the schemes was on extension services, and the other was on horticulture, wherein the government provides loans, subsidies, and other cooperative mechanisms for growing fruits, for growing flowers, varieties of flowers and vegetables. And these 2 schemes actually reach out to women in the sector in agriculture. And interestingly, the Ministry of Agriculture, in all its beneficiary-oriented schemes, reserves 30% of budget for women farmers. So this is very interesting. So at least 30% of budgets for beneficiary sector schemes should reach out to women. So one of the imperatives of the study was also to understand whether this policy, this gender-sensitive policy was actually being implemented on the ground, and if so, to what extent. Now, in terms of our scope, we conducted the study in 2 states across 2 provinces. We picked 6 blocks, essentially, coming down to and conducting this study in 14 villages of 2 states. And what was the approach? Pretty much similar, to the last case study that we discussed. We assessed key scheme documents. We conducted focus group discussions, key informant interviews with diverse set of actors. Also conducted field visits, and I had the opportunity to actually attend, some of the field visits under this project. And we had a really strong expert on agriculture and gender who conducted this study for us. Next slide, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, can we? Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, so in terms of findings, one of the key findings of the study using the GRB lens was that the operational guidelines, for the 2 schemes that I discussed with you, one on extension, one on horticulture, were not adequate to mainstream gender at all levels. So the guidelines did not integrate gender along the planning, budgeting, implementation, and monitoring phases. So lacking. So the guidelines were lacking. So if you have the policy document which is lacking, again, we go back to the budgeting and planning cycle. If you do not integrate gender at the formulation stage, then it is really unlikely, impossible, not just unlikely, but close to impossible, that you will, that gender will be mainstreamed at the implementation level and at the evaluation and monitoring stages. The other finding was that although the schemes that we studied offered some space, limited space for participation of women farmers in decision making via committees, via groups that were prescribed under these schemes. There were still no efforts being made for mainstreaming women's role, in decision making, in marketing, in extension services, and as a result of that, there weren't, although there is a large percentage of women farmers, there weren't many women beneficiaries of these two schemes. Although the intent was to reach out through at least 30% budgets to these beneficiaries. I will just take one concrete example to put what I'm saying into perspective. So when we looked at one of the horticulture schemes that provided about 22,000 USD dollars in subsidies. That's a big amount to farmers. We compared it to another scheme within extension, which offered just about $150 of capital for women security groups, for food security groups. And so food security groups were essentially led by women farmers, and there were no women farmers who could access the subsidy for 22,000 US dollars of 22,000 US dollars. The hard within the traditional roles of food security providers or women groups, women farmers who are expected to lead these programs, whereas when it comes to higher end subsidies, these really go to male farmers, and not just male farmers, but farmers who are actually wealthier, and who can afford this subsidy. One of the, of course, one of the recurrent findings has been that there is no sex disaggregated data. Yet, it is such a recurrent finding in all our programs, not just GRB, or in all our programs, yet there is so little that we have access to in terms of sex disaggregated data. So there is no, like I was sharing, there is no data on the number of women who own agricultural land, in the country. There is just no data on that. So if you don't have the data, and if all your subsidies are actually tied to land collaterals, and if you have to get credit, that's also tied to land collaterals, then it is not surprising that women also have limited opportunities, for credit in agriculture. So these are some of the findings that I have shared with you. I believe it is time. I might have run a little bit out of time. Elizabeth, it is actually through from my end. So yeah, I am to now take a break
Yes, thank you,
and
Shrijna.
receive
I think
questions.
it was, yes, it was very interesting. Sometimes we have issues with your connection, but in general, we could very well understand your presentation, and it's really interesting to see how to apply that in concrete cases. So now I'm giving the floor to Sabrina. So she can share her screen and um, she can show us the questions from participants. I know that we said it would be 1 hour. I hope you can spend some 15 minutes more for the question and answer session. And that's all. Maybe we can continue the discussion also with in the forum with Alex, or let's see what happens. Sabrina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I
Yes, I
can. I
can.
can.
Okay, so the first question is from Marte. I'll just read it out. So in relation to the first poll question, how do we understand adopted? The country that I'm studying for the module, Thailand, would seem to fall within the 100. But my impression so far gives me the impression that the adoption of GRB in Thailand is very superficial, lip service, you could even say. How can you prevent that a country claims to adopt GRB without investing both the efforts and budget truly needed to make a difference? So what do you think, Shrijna? I think it's a really interesting question, actually.
Yes, it's a really interesting question. I would say it's also very, very critical. Critical to how do we really define GRB? How do we look at countries adopting GRB? So can we come up, with a blueprint for what adopting, GRB really means? Unfortunately, we don't have a blueprint. Why? Because countries in the regions have used, their own ways of of using GRB, of applying GRB. Uh, Adopting, to me, I would say a good blueprint for adopting GRB would be when GRB is actually institutionalized, at the government level. That's how I would define adopting GRB. But to respond to this really interesting question, the 100 countries that we mentioned, in our poll, they have experimented with GRB in one way or the other. So you're right. So you could refer to Thailand as one example. You could refer to India, that institutionalized, GRB way back in 2005. And what do I mean by institutionalization? The Ministry of Finance directed line ministries to set up gender budgeting cells, to publish gender budget statements. So that's really one way of ensuring that there is uptake on GRB at the government level. If you look at countries, in southeastern regions, including Indonesia, a lot of GRB work has actually been, or Australia for that matter, these days, nowadays, or the UK for that matter. The civil society is really holding the baton, for GRB. So there can be no, blueprint for adopting GRB. Having said that, for sustaining the work on GRB, it is paramount that governments support it, they adopt it, and they should adopt it by institutionalizing it. So when we say 100 countries, we mean these countries that have experimented with GRB. There are very few countries in the West, unfortunately, that have experimented with GRB. A 2016 OECD report says that only about half of the OECD countries have used one or the other means, on GRB. So this is an open question, and it's a really interesting one, but I hope I've answered it, to some extent.
Shrijna, if I may add, we had a webinar on the indicator 5 of the SDGs, no? Indicator 5C1. So this indicator is intended for countries to report on if they are applying GRB or not, and they have questions, no? They have to respond to. So I will not develop here, but I will send the link in the forum so that you can see we did in fact a webinar on this, so you will be able to see it. So those are guiding questions, and we consider that if you respond yes to all of them, then you would be a country that implements GRB. But let's continue with the next one.
Right.
Thank you for the comments, and thank you, Shrijna, for the reply. The next question is from Elizabeth. And so she asked, in the first slide on the budget cycle, you mentioned in the third phase 3 tools, PET, social audits, and citizen cards. Can you explain what they consist in? So what I'm going to do is put back on the PowerPoint presentation. It was this slide, right? So if you, do you want to see the question again?
No, thank you. I have a sense of the question. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that question. And I think one has to apologize for using these abbreviations and not really spelling them out. So PETS, it is the acronym for Public Expenditure Tracking Survey. Now, this is a sound methodology developed by the World Bank, and I believe the World Bank started off the tracking survey in education. So this is really the World Bank's methodology, and so like I said, we don't always have to have isolated, exclusive, GRB only tools to work on GRB. So you can very well use the World Bank's public expenditure tracking survey, and you can now pretty much understand what this survey would be all about by its name, that it really tracks public expenditure, over time and across indicators. And for those of us who are interested, we can just kind of get more information, from the World Bank website. And they have, I believe, they started off conducting these surveys in the Africas, in some countries in Africa, and have had really sound results on monitoring, public expenditure and holding governments, to account. So that's really, a useful tool. So how could one? So one has to look at the PETs, at the Public Expenditure Tracking Survey, and then plug in, GRB, into the methodology of PETs to ensure that, it integrates gender in full scale. So that's really about PETs. Social audits. Social audits, I can give a concrete example from India. Now, see, social audits are being led by civil society in our country, in India. One of government's flagship schemes on employment generation for the rural people of the country. It is called the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Generation Scheme. Has been on for more than a decade now. So the civil society, what is really interesting about this particular scheme is that its guidelines mandates social audits, for the scheme. which means that the civil society monitors this scheme, works with the local governments at the grassroots, compiles reports, and submits it, to the government. Social audit essentially means that a diverse set of actors, including the civil society, are involved in auditing, the scheme, and not just auditing the finances, but auditing various indicators, of a scheme, so that there is local ownership, for the scheme. And the social audits for this employment generation scheme have been so successful that the percentage of women's participation in this employment generation scheme has actually gone way beyond the mandated 33%. In some states, women participate, in over 90. Women's participation is over 90% in some states. So that's really, how you could do social audits. The citizens could do social audits. Now, the other one is the citizen report card. Now, a citizen report card is somewhat similar to social audit. A citizen report card is when citizens uh, uh, hold the governments accountable, and they own, a policy or a scheme. They have local ownership, to a policy or scheme. So, for example, if you go to a school, and if you are conducting, an audit, and if you're involving parents, just to take an example, village committees, in that audit, and if you allow, citizens to put together, a report and do a survey, that's a very, that'll really add on to the transparency, of a given scheme. So these are really, really innovative schemes that have been used, in India, and that are being used in other regions, of the world as well. Elizabeth, over to you. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, you answered it. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Let's go to the next one, and then I think we have to finalize, Sabrina.
Right.
So the last question is from Alexandra, and relating to the case studies, so both of them, how government accepted findings and what they did with that. Have they fixed policies?
This is, I believe, this is a benchmark question, such an interesting question, a benchmark question. I call it a benchmark because how else, do you then ensure that the government actually institutionalizes, GRB via recommendations. The first case study, was on these schools for minority girls. So let me be honest, right? So one of the challenges, constant challenges that advocates of GRB, whether it is multilateral agencies like UN Women or the civil society face, is getting, governments on board to work on GRB. So, however, in the first case study, with for the minority girls, UN Women ended up engaging with civil society to ensure that we enhanced their capacities to hold, governments accountable, via tracking via tracking the results for these programs. So not much not much gained, in really ensuring that the government took the findings from the first study. However, if you look at the other study and what I mentioned, so when we worked with worked with the Ministry of Agriculture, and we ensured that we also worked with the subnational governments, we put together a module, and we contextualized it to agriculture, and we held trainings for officers across levels, at the national level, at the subnational level, wherein we trained these officers on applying GRB. So the first step was to orient these officers, and the landmark result for us was when the government itself reached out to UN Women and asked us to train their officers on GRB. And let me tell you that this initiative is still ongoing. Only last year, 100+ officers were trained at the subnational level, at the divisional, provisional level on GRB in one of the states, on agriculture, and now we are working with the state government on revising their monitoring format for agriculture, for ensuring that there is scope for recording sex disaggregated data, that there is scope for recording proportional outputs for women and men farmers and other constituencies. So we've had mixed results, mixed uptakes for the two for the two case studies that I discussed. But having said that, UN Women India continues to liaise with our nodal ministry at the national level on gender responsive budgeting. And one of our key areas of work in the coming months is to put together a blueprint on GRB for all states. So it's going to be massive, massive. Thank you. I hope I've answered a bit of your question. If not, all of it. Alexandra.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Shrijna. I think Sabrina, do we have other questions?
No, that was all.
Okay, so I really want to thank you very much, Shrijna, because we learned a lot. It's very good to know those experiences. I would like to give the mic to Alexandra if she wants to connect your presentation with the course, and also if she has specific messages for participants. Alex?
Hi to everyone. I hope you're all fine. Thank you very much for your presentation and for giving us examples from India that are going to be very helpful. And some of the issues that you have covered in your presentation, they are actually, we have talked a lot about them in our Forum 1, and and now we are continuing in the second forum. Basically, we were discussing what are the key successes and what are the challenges in the GRB process, and how these capacities and the recognizing of the gender gaps in a society, and how the government responds to the policies, and what are the capacities to do that, and how all that interconnect together. So this is going to be really very helpful. Especially, I would like to emphasize several things that you have mentioned. First of all, importance of the understanding of the context, not only in terms of the gender gaps, but also in terms of the capacities of the government to address, and the policies to address the particular issues, but also overall situation in a society, availability of funds, and connections between the local and the national level, and where the problem really is, and how it's important actually to well understand it. And we are on the first module, we really talk a lot about that, like what is the real problem that we are solving. The second thing that I would like to emphasize and connect with our module 1 is actually that the GRB is a long-term process. It starts with some analysis, but it took us some time before we can really do something with the findings. So there is lots of things to be involved, and again, government commitment is really very important. And that these, from the formulation stage to the audit, and then the whole process continues, it never stops. We discussed in our forum how it's important that we work, that we never stops when we start working on GRB. It's an ongoing process. That's why institutionalization of the process inside the institutions is very important, and that is going to be elements of the other modules that we are going to discuss. So I would like to thank you again, and I would also like to stop here. Maybe some